Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I don't know if we ever really covered this. I mean, I guess we kind of did, but if we did do it, then it was back in the day when my video sucked, and so if we did cover it, we're going to remaster it. But we're basically doing the Crooked World story, and the reason why we're doing this is because of what's going on with X of Swords and the return of Jim Jaspers, right? There's been a lot of talk, especially in my videos, about how powerful Jim Jaspers is, about what he's capable of, and how dangerous of a character that he is. But in reality, I don't really think a lot of people are fully aware of what Jim Jaspers can do and what makes him so powerful and really so dangerous, and this story really covers it. Now, the other part of why we're doing this is because this also covers the nature of Saturnyne, right? The role she plays and when she was really kind of first introduced into Marvel Comics. Now, a couple things to understand here. This story, The Crooked World, was technically kind of collected into a more recent 7-issue story. When I say recent, I mean back in the mid-90s. But this story was really first launched when Marvel was creating what was called Marvel UK. And Marvel UK was quite literally Marvel Comics' attempt to expand into the United Kingdom, and of course they did it by creating Captain Britain. The result of this is that you had Alan Moore and Alan Davis who essentially put this story together, and so one part of this is kind of a reworking of the history of Captain Britain in terms of rolling him more in line with the main Marvel Comics universe itself, and then the other part is everything going on in the Crooked World. So we're only going to really cover the second part here. We're going to kind of skim over a lot of the stuff like the reworking of his story and his powers and things like that, because that's not overly important here, right? I mean, what you know about Captain Britain right now in terms of reading X of Swords is all that really matters when it comes to his character, and Jim Jaspers is really the main focus here, right? So this initially picks up with both Brian Brad, Captain Britain, as well as a character named Jackdaw. Now, Jackdaw was initially introduced in the old Captain Britain stories as essentially a sidekick, right? Because this was written back in the 1980s, and this was still a time in comic books where sidekicks were still a relatively prominent thing. The reality is that sidekicks have kind of been going the wayside ever since the 1960s, right? But it took about 20 years for us to see sidekicks in a lot of ways beginning to go away. A lot of that was because of Batman, because the Robin character, the Robin archetype, was still exceedingly popular, and it really has been. It's one of those things where I think publishers outside of DC kind of failed to understand that the popularity of Robin was because he was effectively a legacy character. Not every sidekick that was out there was popular or needed to be there. And so Jackdaw was actually one of these characters that was kind of being phased out at the time this story was being written. The other part of this is that in the early Captain Britain stories, he was given a scepter that kind of allowed him to channel and use his powers. This too is something that was being removed, and that's the reason why when he's sent on this mission to this alternate reality in Earth 238, but not really given any indication of what the mission is, once he passes through that dimensional barrier, his costume changes and he loses his scepter, right? This is kind of a really on the nose, like this is the new Captain Britain now. But the idea here is that once he's sent into this location, he immediately stumbles upon what is in effect a bank heist, right? Like this robbery going wrong. Now, this robbery is being held by a group called the Crazy Gang, or being orchestrated by a group called the Crazy Gang. And Captain Britain does what he does, right? He kind of beats him up a little bit and says, hey, you know, you guys need to stop, all that kind of stuff. But while all that's going on, Jim Jaspers is watching it happen. And it's really because the Crazy Gang kind of seems to be operating at the behest of Jim Jaspers, right? They're basically his henchmen and they're kind of carrying out his plot. But the whole purpose behind this is really just more for fun and games. That what you have is you have Jim Jaspers, who created the Executioner, who has the Executioner here, and he's also got the Queen of Hearts, right? So you guys kind of notice it's very similar to Alice in Wonderland in terms of how this goes on. And the result of this is that when he asks the Queen, what should we do? Her response is off with his head, right? And that's when the Executioner comes along, and then it leaves Captain Britain taking the fight outside. Now again, Jim Jaspers is kind of watching all this unfold, right? He's watching all this take place, and is kind of entertained by it, right? Like, this is kind of interesting, right? I'm kind of intrigued by everything I'm seeing. He does, of course, want to see Captain Britain defeated, but he is kind of intrigued here. Now, with this fight basically getting to the outdoors, and essentially, you know, the forces of the Crazy Gang being defeated, Jim Jaspers gets into his flying teapot, and then basically takes off, right? He just ends up escaping with the Crazy Gang, and then that's basically it, right? And so, you know, the Dormouse is the one flying it, so you could tell right off the bat, things are a little wonky here. And then, of course, Captain Britain kind of looks around and is like, none of this really makes sense. Like, this is kind of wild. I don't really understand this. And he ends up finding a poster on a wall that says kind of re-elect the British National Party, right? Which is staunchly different from what we see in the main Marvel universe, where the British National Party doesn't really exist as like a major figurehead, right? They're not ruling anything. And so what you end up getting is really Jackdaw Jackdaw and Captain Britain kind of going through and checking out and investigating a few things inside of London itself, right, to figure out the differences between the universe they're from and this place that they're in. Now, this is when we kind of skim over stuff and sort of throw in a few little highlights here and there, but for most everything else, we can kind of blow it off. But one of the big takeaways that comes out of all this is that everything really is just starkly different, right? Everything really is just starkly different, and they don't really understand why, right? They're not really able to fully grasp why things are so intriguing here. What you also have are three major things that take place. The first is these various, homeless people who are out there that are drinking this alcohol, and Jackdaw ends up drinking a little bit of it as well, and it's almost like they have this kind of mental awakening of how things truly are. Now, for the most part, because they're homeless and because they're the outcasts of society, nobody takes them seriously, and they consider their ramblings about how things appear versus how things really are to really just be some kind of psychosis or a drunken stupor or something like that. But the second thing that happens is there's this giant heap of machinery that actually just kind of became sentient more or less and is walking around and causing all kinds of chaos. Now, Captain Britain responds and ends up basically kind of defeating this thing, but also drawing the attention of the military forces that are out there, right? Or at least the kind of paramilitary forces. They're technically individuals that are specialized in taking on superpowered beings. And so right now we know that like superpowered beings exist or have existed in this universe. So Captain Britain's not the very first one they've ever seen, but he's able to kind of get past these guys pretty easily and take out the junk heap that walked like a man, right? So that happens pretty fast, pretty quickly. Now, these guys who exist out there for the purpose of taking out superheroes, that's kind of an important thing. Those guys specifically are not, but the force they will bring in for the purpose of taking down superheroes will prove to be exceedingly important. But the other thing that happens is that once this junk heap is basically defeated and it's just kind of left in this great big huge, crumpled heap, that you end up having Captain Britain who sort of looks around for what this stuff is, right? For like how it is that this happened. And people are talking about a kind of fluid or something like that. And he stumbles across this sewer drain where this sort of, reddish fluid is coming out. And when he crawls through the drain and traces it back to its energy source or to its location, he comes across a rat called archenemy, right? He's just the rat thing, right? And this is a walking, talking rat who lives in the sewer and is like, not super intelligent, but like a human level intelligence, right? So like he's basically achieved sentience. And it's kind of a strange thing because while that's happening, you also have something called the avant-garde. And the avant-garde is really kind of introduced to us a little bit mysteriously. We don't really know much about them. All we really know is they're led by a woman who's referred to as Her Highness. But she starts talking about this concept of initiating something called the push, and that the rat himself is the result of the push, right? Which is to say, this chemical that exists that's kind of being put out there, this rat consumed it, and that's why it's so intelligent. Now, what all that means will come to fruition exceedingly soon, right? So I'm not gonna leave you guys hanging on why all that's important. But what does matter here is that Captain Britain was in effect an unexpected entity here, right? He wasn't really expected to be here. And so what you end up getting is essentially the avant-garde who kind of step in for the purpose of detaining Captain Britain. Now, he ends up getting the upper hand on him, basically kind of defeating him to a degree, or at least that seems to be the case, but then ultimately they get the upper hand on him. And the way in which they do this comes in the form of a kind of mysterious energy beam. This energy beam is shot at the rat, which kind of devolves him back down into a base level, and then is shot at Captain Britain, which devolves him back down into a monkey, right? And so following that, he's basically captured and taken by the avant-garde, and then in turn, we're properly introduced to Saturnyne. Now, Saturnyne, as she's introduced here, and as we're informed by her, is basically part of a group called the Omniversal Development Court. Now, something that I do want to point out here is that back then in the 1980s, when this story was written, this was done at a time when the Living Tribunal was not something that was constantly invoked. Nowadays, in Marvel Comics, anything that really involves the multiverse on a grand scale, the Living Tribunal pops up. Back then, it wasn't really the case. The expectation on the publishing side was tell the story as if it's in isolation and introduce new concepts if you can, things that are interesting, but don't use the Living Tribunal as an easy way out. And that's why we don't really see the Tribunal here. Instead, what we get in its place is a creation by Alan Moore and Alan Davis called the Omniversal Development Court. And the way this works is that in every universe across the multiverse, they all sort of progress at a particular rate, and that at a particular point in time, certain things are supposed to happen, right? So you have what's called the 50,000 year program, which basically says that at some point, we can call this point zero, 50,000 years from that point in time, we're supposed to get a kind of evolutionary process. Now, how this works in tandem with like the Celestials experimenting on humanity, we're not really given a definitive explanation here. We can largely kind of make assumptions that around 50,000 years before this point in time, when superheroes are supposed to appear, is essentially when modern man became what it is. And we can largely kind of tie these numbers together, and it really kind of makes sense that about 50,000 years before the emergence of superheroes is when the Celestials experimented on early man. And so that's why the Omniversal Development Court seems to fall in line with the Celestials. Celestials, right? That as part of the Celestials' grand experiment, they travel from world to world, experimenting on the early primitive versions of its inhabitants, and then basically granting them powers. On Earth, they did the exact same thing, right? On Earth, they showed up, they took 1/3 of humanity, and then broke that 1/3 into thirds itself. That one group became the Eternals, another group became the Deviants, and the third group were individuals whose powers would manifest at some future point in time. What seems to happen is the Omniversal Development Court picks up from there, and they basically make sure that this evolutionary push, which is to say that the genes manifest, so basically we get like X-Men, and we get mutants, and we get Avengers and Fantastic Four, that all that stuff happens about 50,000 years after the Celestials first visit Earth. And it happens across every single universe, right? And so because of that, on this Earth, there are no superheroes. And that's why Saturnyne and the really her forces are here, is to initiate the push that it has to be achieved by the year 2000. And that because there are no superheroes here, her assumption is that superheroes just simply never evolved, right? For whatever reason, those genes never really activated. And so the intention here is to initiate the push to force those genes to activate to create superheroes on Earth, right? It's just what the Omniversal Development Court does. Now, when that happens, and when Captain Britain basically kind of is aged back up to his normal self, right? When his evolution is kicked back up to where it's supposed to be, he basically really evolves back into a man. This is one part Alan Moore and Alan Davis giving him like new levels of super strength and speed and durability, things like that, enhancing his powers. But it also allows him to basically kind of grab Saturnyne, right? And say like, what's going on here? And that's when she really kind of explains everything that I just told you guys in terms of what she does and all that kind of stuff. But what she also ends up revealing here is that their intention is to essentially take this substance, this liquid that they have, and put it into the water supply. And the water supply, or putting it there, will basically allow people to consume it, and that'll in turn start pushing them to a higher evolutionary state. And it'll basically allow them to see the world the way that it really is, because one of the things that's kind of hint here is that Jim Jaspers has kind of used his powers to distort the way the Earth appears as opposed to the way that it actually is. But the other thing it'll do, it'll start jump-starting powers, right? People will start getting superpowers. And so while that happens, you have essentially the status crew that shows up here. And the status crew is kind of a military group that works for the government in England. And that's kind of the superhero group that travels around and like captures superpowered beings or takes them out, basically eliminates superpowered threats. And for the most part, they're all taken out pretty quickly by Captain Britain, Saturnyne, the avant-garde. Those guys are defeated quite handedly. But in the middle of all that, these various guys are essentially splashed with this evolutionary chemical by Captain Britain. And that's when they start to realize like they've been used, right? Their minds have essentially been tricked. And so if telepathy, which seems to be the case, has been used by Jim Jaspers, or at least some kind of reality warping ability, then in turn, it basically takes away that effect. And they start to see the world the way it is, that by virtue of their actions, they've created grave injustices, right? Like they've oppressed social classes, different things like that. And so realizing the effect that it has, Captain Britain basically ends up traveling out for the purpose of ensuring that this liquid is actually put into the water supply and that everything goes according to plan. Now, for the most part, it seemingly does, right? That once this stuff is put into the water supply and everything, the push begins to happen, the various citizens from across London start to kind of have this awakening, right? They start to realize, okay, nothing in this world is the way that it's supposed to be, right? Like things are screwed up, that we need to focus on making things better. Now, this is really kind of Alan Moore and Alan Davis sort of criticizing society at the time and just kind of being like, people need to wake up, wake up sheeple, that kind of a thing, and make the world a better place. But what ends up going on is that while this huge celebration is happening and that essentially this will lead to people developing powers, that during all this time, everybody forgot about Jaspers, right? Everybody forgot about Jim Jaspers, and so did Saturnyne, or she never considered him to be important in the first place, because in her mind, she never knew that he was the cause of all this. And so Jim Jaspers watches all this unfold. He lets them savor this moment, and then he initiates the Jaspers warp. And the Jaspers warp literally just starts twisting up the entirety of reality. Like it really just starts warping it, twisting it, skewing it, turning it inside out. The laws of physics begin to go upside down, so gravity starts pushing away instead of pulling in. All kinds of crazy things start to pop off. When that happens, nobody in the Omniversal Development Court knows what's going on. And the biggest fear is that this is a result of the push, that when they did this, they did something wrong, that they screwed something up, and they totally screwed up the world, right? They literally broke the world. And so in response to this, you basically have the status crew that shows back up with a being called the Fury. And as they describe it, the Fury was designed and programmed for the sole purpose of killing superheroes, right? That's its sole purpose, is basically killing superheroes. And so following that, the Fury literally kind of goes on the attack, and where Captain Britain launches an attack against it, nothing happens, right? I mean, this guy has no answer for the power of the Fury. And so Saturnyne, seeing what's going on, grabs the avant-garde and is like, let's go. Like, I don't know what's going on in this world, but this place is screwed, right? I'm just going to get while the getting's good, and we'll figure out what to do later. And so while that happens, the Fury Fury just goes on a rampage and literally just starts annihilating everybody. It kills Jackdaw, right, which is them kind of beginning the process of writing Jackdaw out. It goes after Captain Britain, and then of course in the middle of this whole fight, suddenly Jim Jaspers shows up, right, in his flying teapot and rescues Captain Britain. And this is when we start to get into the meat and potatoes of what it is that makes Mad Jim Jaspers so powerful. And so as he's having, as he kind of grabs Captain Britain and flies away, the Fury stops. Right? The Fury does nothing. It doesn't go after Jim Jaspers or anybody. And so from there, Jim Jaspers kind of starts breaking down the conversation. Now, once Captain Britain gets in here, he immediately knows something's off because the inside of this flying teapot is much bigger than the flying teapot itself. He kind of starts breaking things down, and he says here in this universe that he's in, that he was a member of parliament, and that he realized, at some point in time, he had the ability to manipulate reality, right? He had the ability to control reality on a universal scale. But his powers are continually growing. And so what this shows is that this version of Jaspers is still relatively new to his abilities. And so they more or less seem to have just recently manifested. And so in light of that, and realizing the power that he possessed, that the wrong move to make would have just been to distort reality. That the best move to make when it comes to taking over people is to get them to believe you. It's one thing to conquer people, it's another to get them to be willing to be conquered. And that's what he was doing, right? What he ended up doing was passing legislation, or at least pushing through the idea of legislation of superhuman registration, saying like we need to basically get rid of all the superheroes. And because of the fact that he was able to rally various people to his side, this basically led to him kind of forcing this legislation through Parliament. In response to that, he in turn created the Fury and literally just went through and started killing everybody, right? Killing all the different superheroes. Now there was a Captain Britain in this universe, and we'll actually find more about her here in a little while, but the Fury just in a matter of something like 2 years killed every single superhero on Earth, right? Everybody on Earth. Now, there's a lot that we're not being told here. We're not being told if the Fury killed like the Fantastic Four and the X-Men and the Avengers. Marvel UK was largely kind of a separate imprint. You did see some reprints of comics from America in Marvel UK, which is them that was them testing the waters and seeing if there was an interest there. That's what made Captain Britain so important. It was the first time that Britain really got from Marvel Comics their own character in a series of newly created stories, as opposed to reprints of old stories, right? So that's why you don't really see a lot of other superhero teams here, because a lot of the emphasis was put directly on Captain Britain, because they were trying to push the idea of a British superhero community. But Brian Braddock comes to the realization that one, Jim Jaspers created the Fury and programmed it, and so the Fury will basically kill every single superhero on Earth except for Jim Jaspers. It's just basically programmed not to. And that two, the reason Jaspers did this is because he just wanted to eliminate the competition. He just wanted to be the most powerful mutant on Earth. And the reason why everything in this reality is so weird and wonky, you have like the Crazy Gang, a lot of things reminiscent of like Alice in Wonderland, all this kind of crazy stuff that's happening is because of the fact that Jim Jaspers' powers are expanding. And while he is able to control them, he's experimenting. He's seeing what he can do, how much of reality he can change. And so as time progresses, his hold on reality becomes stronger and stronger, to the point that he initiated this Jaspers warp and started twisting everything up. And so what ends up happening is that in the middle of this conversation, that basically Jim Jaspers kind of created illusions of everybody that Brian Braddock knows, like Jackdaw, of course, who's dead, all these people he encountered, like it's really him just screwing with the mind of Brian Braddock. And so in the midst of all this, Brian panics, and then just out of the teapot he goes, right? Out of the flying teapot he goes, and he ends up landing in a cemetery, and then basically he's just kind of there going nuts, right? He believes he's actually losing his mind, right? And he believes he's been abandoned by Merlin. Merlin, of course, being the person who's responsible for creating Captain Britain and the one who sent him on this mission, is kind of like, why did you put me here, right? Like, why have you just abandoned me in this place? This is insane. Like, there's no hope for me here. And that's absolutely true, right? This universe is beyond saving at this point. And so what you end up getting is a Fury who comes out of nowhere and basically obliterates Captain Britain. And when that happens, you kind of jump over to the main Marvel universe for a second, and you end up seeing Captain UK. And what you find out is that this grave where Captain Britain was killed, where Brian Braddock was killed and tossed in, that grave was meant for Captain UK. The Captain UK was the Captain Britain from this universe, that when everything popped off and the Fury ended up losing his mind, or Fury was kind of sent on this mission of killing everybody, that she basically abandoned the reality, right? She basically got out of the Earth 238 universe, and then is essentially a refugee in the main Marvel universe, that nobody knew that she was there, and that she's still experiencing PTSD and anxiety from like the whole experience of seeing everybody that she knows that was killed. And so following that, you go go into the resurrection of Brian Braddock. You go into Captain Britain, who's basically resurrected by Merlin and his daughter Roma, the ones who were responsible for creating, you know, all this Captain Britain stuff. And we're kind of given a little bit of a history there. Again, it's not overly important. They kind of just sort of ensure that he remembers everything that happened. And the reason why is because sending him to the Earth 238 universe, that was a test. It was just an experiment to see how he would fare against somebody like Jim Jaspers. And the reason why is because the purpose of him being sent on that mission was not to really defeat the Earth 238 Jim Jaspers, but to prepare him for when he faces off against Mad Jim Jaspers from the main Marvel universe. Because as powerful as that version of Jim Jaspers was from Earth 238, that guy is nothing, absolutely nothing in comparison to the power of Mad Jim Jaspers from the main Marvel universe, which is something that we'll cover in the next video. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.